This is section 18 of Happy Homes and the Hearts That Make Them, by Samuel Smiles. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 18, Courage, read by John Greenman. If thou canst plan a noble deed, and never flag till it succeed, though in the strife thy heart should bleed, whatever obstacles control, thine hour will come. Go on, true soul. Thou'lt win the prize, thou'lt reach the goal. C. Mackey. The heroic example of other days is in great part the source of the courage of each generation, and men walk up composedly to the most perilous enterprises, beckoned onward by the shades of the braves that were. Helps. The world owes much to its men and women of courage. We do not mean physical courage, in which man is at least equaled by the bulldog, nor is the bulldog considered the wisest of his species. The courage that displays itself in silent effort and endeavor, that dares to endure all and suffer all for truth and duty, is more truly heroic than the achievements of physical valor, which are rewarded by honors and titles, or by laurels sometimes steeped in blood. It is moral courage that characterizes the highest order of manhood and womanhood, the courage to seek and to speak the truth, the courage to be just, the courage to be honest, the courage to resist temptation, the courage to do one's duty. If men and women do not possess this virtue, they have no security whatever for the preservation of any other. Every step of progress in the history of our race has been made in the face of opposition and difficulty, and been achieved and secured by men of intrepidity and valor, by leaders in the van of thought, by great discoverers, great patriots, and great workers in all walks of life. There is scarcely a great truth or doctrine but has had to fight its way to public recognition in the face of detraction, calumny, and persecution. Everywhere, says Heine, that a great soul gives utterance to its thoughts, there also is Golgotha. Socrates was condemned to drink the hemlock at Athens in his 72nd year, because his lofty teaching ran counter to the prejudices and party spirit of his age. He was charged by his accusers with corrupting the youth of Athens, by inciting them to despise the tutelary deities of the state. He had the moral courage to brave not only the tyranny of the judges who condemned him, but of the mob who could not understand him. He died discoursing of the doctrine of the immortality of the soul, his last words to his judges being, "It is now time that we depart, I to die, you to live, but which has the better destiny is unknown to all except to God." How many great men and thinkers have been persecuted in the name of religion! Bruno was burnt alive at Rome because of his exposure of the fashionable but false philosophy of his time. When the judges of the Inquisition condemned him to die, Bruno said proudly, "You are more afraid to pronounce my sentence than I am to receive it." There was scarcely a great discovery in astronomy, in natural history, or in physical science, which was not once denounced as leading to infidelity. The followers of Copernicus were branded as unbelievers. After Lippershey had invented the telescope, Galileo took up the idea, and constructed a telescope of his own, with which he ascended the tower of St. Mark at Venice to view the heavenly bodies. He directed it to the planets and fixed stars, which he observed with incredible delight. He discovered the satellites and rings of Jupiter, the phases of Venus, and the spots on the sun. He faithfully recorded the revelations that came down to him direct from the skies. But all this was at variance with the received ideas of the time. The Inquisition undertook to regulate the astronomical science. Galileo was called to Rome, and summoned before the inquisitors to answer for the heretical doctrines he had published. He was compelled to renounce his opinions. He declared that he abandoned the doctrine of the earth's motion around the sun. The inquisitors inserted in the prohibited index the works of Galileo, Kepler, and Copernicus. Galileo plucked up heart again, and published a new work in the form of a dialogue, defending his doctrines. He was summoned before the Inquisition, and compelled, on bended knees, to renounce and abjure his glorious discovery. Galileo wanted the courage of his opinions, but he was an old man of 70 when he denied his faith. Galileo would not have been persecuted could he have been answered. Yet the truth lived, and men were set on the right track of observation for all ages to come. Pascal said of his condemnation, "It is in vain that you have procured against Galileo a decree from Rome condemning his opinions of the earth's motion. Assuredly that will never prove it to be at rest. And if we have unerring observations proving that it turns round, not all mankind together can keep it from turning, nor themselves from turning with it." The life of Kepler was as sad as that of Galileo. Originally a poor boy, he was admitted to the school at the monastery at Mulbroom, and eventually became a learned man. He accepted the astronomical chair at Graz, and devoted himself to the study of the planets. He was afterward appointed imperial mathematician to the emperor, though his salary was insufficient to maintain himself and his family. He was excommunicated by the Church because of some opinions he had expressed respecting transubstantiation. "Judge," he said to Hoffman, "how far I can assist you, in a place where the priest and school inspector have combined to brand me with the public stigma of heresy, because in every question I take that side which seems to me consonant with the will of God." Kepler was then offered the professorship of mathematics at Bologna, but having the recantation and condemnation of Galileo before him, he declined the chair. "I might," he said, "notably increase my fortune, but, living a German among Germans, I am accustomed to a freedom of speech and manners which, if persevered in at Bologna, would draw upon me, if not danger, at least notoriety, and might expose me to suspicion and party malice." In 1619 Kepler discovered the celebrated law, which will be ever memorable in the history of science, that the squares of the periodic times of the planets are to one another as the cubes of their distances. He recognized with transport the absolute truth of a principle which, for 17 years, had been the object of his incessant labors. "The die is cast," he said, "the book is written, to be read either now or by posterity, I care not which. It may well wait a century for a reader, as God has waited 6,000 years for an observer." The next book Kepler published, the epitome of the Copernican astronomy, was condemned at Rome and placed in the prohibited index. In the meantime his mind was distracted by a far greater trouble. His mother, 79 years old, was thrown into prison, condemned to torture, and was about to be burned as a witch. Kepler immediately flew to her relief, and arrived at his Swabian home in time to save her from further punishment. But more troubles followed. The states of Styria ordered all the copies of his Calendar for 1624 to be publicly burned. His library was sealed up by order of the Jesuits, and he was compelled to leave Linz by the popular insurrection which then prevailed. He went to Sagan in Silesia, and shortly after died there of disease of the brain, the result of too much study. When Columbus stated his views to King Ferdinand, the clergy declared that the theory of an Antipodes was hostile to the faith. The earth, they said, was an immense flat disk, and if there was a new earth beyond the ocean, then all men could not be descended from Adam. Columbus was dismissed as a fool. Roger Bacon, the Franciscan monk, was persecuted on account of his studies in natural philosophy, and he was charged with dealing in magic because of his investigations in chemistry. His writings were condemned, and he was thrown into prison, where he lay for 10 years, during the lives of 4 successive popes. It is even averred that he died in prison. Occam, the early English speculative philosopher, was excommunicated and died in exile at Munich, where he was protected by the friendship of the Emperor of Germany. The Inquisition branded Vesalius as a heretic for revealing man to man, as it had before branded Bruno and Galileo for revealing the heavens to man. Vesalius had the boldness to study the structure of the human body by actual dissection, a practice until then almost entirely forbidden. He laid the foundations of a science, but he paid for it with his life. Condemned by the Inquisition, his penalty was commuted, by the intercession of the Spanish king, into a pilgrimage to the Holy Land, and when on his way back, while still in the prime of life, he died miserably at Zante of fever and want, a martyr to his love of science. When the Novum Organon appeared, a hue and cry was raised against it, because of its alleged tendency to produce dangerous revolutions, to subvert governments, and to overturn the authority of religion, and one Dr. Henry Stubb wrote a book against the new philosophy, denouncing the whole tribe of experimentalists as a bacon-faced generation. Even the establishment of the Royal Society was opposed on the ground that experimental philosophy is subversive of the Christian faith. Even the pure and simple-minded Newton, of whom Bishop Burnet said that he had the whitest soul he ever knew, who was a very infant in the purity of his mind, even Newton was accused of dethroning the Deity by his sublime discovery of the law of gravitation, and a similar charge was made against Franklin for explaining the nature of the thunderbolt. Spinoza was excommunicated by the Jews to whom he belonged, because of his views of philosophy, which were supposed to be adverse to religion, and his life was afterwards attempted by an assassin for the same reason. Spinoza remained courageous and self-reliant to the last, dying in obscurity and poverty. The philosophy of Descartes was denounced as leading to irreligion. The doctrines of Locke were said to produce materialism, and in our own day Dr. Buckland, Mr. Sedgwick, and other leading geologists have been accused of overturning revelation with regard to the constitution and history of the earth. Indeed, there has scarcely been a discovery in astronomy, in natural history, or in physical science that has not been attacked by the bigoted and narrow-minded as leading to infidelity. Other great discoverers, though they may not have been charged with irreligion, have had not less obloquy of a professional and public nature to encounter. When Dr. Harvey published his theory of the circulation of the blood, his practice fell off, and the medical profession stigmatized him as a fool. "The few good things I have been able to do," said John Hunter, "have been accomplished with the greatest difficulty, and encountered the greatest opposition." Sir Charles Bell, while employed in his important investigations as to the nervous system, which issued in one of the greatest of physiological discoveries, wrote to a friend, "If I were not so poor, and had not so many vexations to encounter, how happy would I be!" But he himself observed that his practice sensibly fell off after the publication of each successive stage of his discovery. Thus nearly every enlargement of the domain of knowledge, which has made us better acquainted with the heavens, with the earth, and with ourselves, has been established by the energy, the devotion, the self-sacrifice, and the courage of the great spirits of past times, who, however much they have been opposed or reviled by their contemporaries, now rank among those whom the enlightened of the human race most delight to honor. Nor is the unjust intolerance displayed toward men of science in the past without its lesson for the present. It teaches us to be forbearant toward those who differ from us, provided they observe patiently, think honestly, and utter their convictions freely and truthfully. It was a remark of Plato that "the world is God's epistle to mankind, and to read and study that epistle, so as to elicit its true meaning, can have no other effect on a well-ordered mind than to lead to a deeper impression of His power, a clear perception of His wisdom, and a more grateful sense of His goodness. While such has been the courage of the martyrs of science, not less glorious has been the courage of the martyrs of faith. The passive endurance of the man or woman who, for conscience' sake, is found ready to suffer and to endure in solitude, without so much as the encouragement of even a single sympathizing voice, is an exhibition of courage of a far higher kind than that displayed in the roar of battle, where even the weakest feels encouraged and inspired by the enthusiasm of sympathy and the power of numbers. Time would fail to tell of the deathless names of those who, through faith in principles, and in the face of difficulty, danger, and suffering, have wrought righteousness and waxed valiant in the moral warfare of the world, and been content to lay down their lives rather than prove false to their conscientious convictions of the truth. Men of this stamp, inspired by a high sense of duty, have in past times exhibited character in its most heroic aspects, and continue to present to us some of the noblest spectacles to be seen in history. Even women, full of tenderness and gentleness, not less than men, have in this cause been found capable of exhibiting the most unflinching courage. Such, for instance, as that of Anne Askew, who, when racked until her bones were dislocated, uttered no cry, moved no muscle, but looked her tormentors calmly in the face, and refused either to confess or to recant; or such as that of Latimer and Ridley, who, instead of bewailing their hard fate and beating their breasts, went as cheerfully to their death as a bridegroom to the altar, the one bidding the other to be of good comfort, for that we shall this day light such a candle in England by God's grace as shall never be put out; or such again as that of Mary Dyer the Quakeress, hanged by the Puritans of New England for preaching to the people, who ascended the scaffold with a willing step, and after calmly addressing those who stood about, resigned herself into the hands of her persecutors, and died in peace and joy. Not less courageous was the behavior of the good Sir Thomas More, who marched willingly to the scaffold, and died cheerfully there, rather than prove false to his conscience. When More had made his final decision to stand upon his principles, he felt as if he had won a victory, and said to his son-in-law Roper, "Son Roper, I thank our Lord, the field is won." The Duke of Norfolk told him of his danger, saying, "By the mass, Master More, it is perilous striving with princes. The anger of a prince brings death." "Is that all, my lord?" said More. "Then the difference between you and me is this, that I shall die to-day, and you to-morrow." Martin Luther was not called upon to lay down his life for his faith, but from the day that he declared himself against the Pope, he daily ran the risk of losing it. At the beginning of his great struggle he stood almost entirely alone. The odds against him were tremendous. "On one side," said he himself, "are learning, genius, numbers, grandeur, rank, power, sanctity, miracles; on the other, Wycliffe, Lorenzo Valla, Augustine, and Luther, a poor creature, a man of yesterday, standing well nigh alone with a few friends." Summoned by the emperor to appear at Worms to answer the charge made against him for heresy, he determined to answer in person. Those about him told him he would lose his life if he went, and they urged him to fly. "No," said he, "I will repair thither, though I should find there twice as many devils as there are tiles upon the housetops." Warned against the bitter enmity of a certain Duke George, he said, "I will go there, though for 9 whole days running it rained Duke Georges." Luther was as good as his word, and he set forth upon his perilous journey. When he came in sight of the old bell towers of Worms, he stood up in his chariot and sang, "Ein feste Burg ist unser Gott." the Marseillaise of the Reformation, the words and music of which he is said to have improvised only 2 days before. Shortly before the meeting of the Diet, an old soldier, George Freudensburg, put his hand upon Luther's shoulder and said to him, good monk, take heed what thou doest. Thou art going into a harder fight than any of us have ever yet been in." But Luther's only answer to the veteran was, that he had "determined to stand upon the Bible and his conscience." Luther's courageous defense before the Diet is on record, and forms one of the most glorious pages in history. When finally urged by the emperor to retract, he said firmly, "Sire, unless I am convinced of my error by the testimony of Scripture, or by manifest evidence, I cannot and will not retract, for we must never act contrary to our conscience. Such is my profession of faith, and you must expect none other from me. Here I stand, I cannot do otherwise. God help me." He had to do his duty, to obey the orders of a power higher than that of kings, and he did it at all hazards. Afterwards, when hard pressed by his enemies at Augsburg, Luther said that, if he had 500 heads, he would lose them all rather than recant his articles concerning faith. Like all courageous men, his strength only seemed to grow in proportion to the difficulties he had to encounter and overcome. "There is no man in Germany," said Hutten, "who more utterly despises death than does Luther; and to his moral courage, perhaps more than to that of any other single man, do we owe the liberation of modern thought, and the vindication of the great rights of the human understanding." But it is a mistake to suppose that the days requiring self-sacrifice and suffering for conscience or the truth's sake are past. Modern freedom, says Thoreau, is only the exchange of the slavery of feudality for the slavery of opinion. The tyranny of a multitude is worse than the tyranny of an individual. How many, even in our own progressive age, have suffered persecution for bravely advocating principles and doctrines which they believe to be true! The decisions reached by councils and conferences are but an expression of the average or popular opinion. Men of earnest thought are generally far in advance of the average sentiment. What wonder is it then that the most profound, the best, the most earnest men of every age have been men who were abused by their associates, or through charges of heresy expelled from the churches? William Penn was of opinion that there was no greater mistake than to suppose that a country or a people were strengthened by all the people holding one opinion, whether upon religious doctrine or religious practice; and that a variety of opinions, of professions, and of practice was a strength to a people and to a government, if all were alike tolerated. Individuality must be upheld, for without individuality there can be no liberty. Individuality is everywhere to be spared and respected as the root of everything good. Even despotism does not produce its worst effects, says John Stuart Mill, so long as individuality exists under it; and whatever crushes individuality is despotism, by whatever name it may be called, and whether it professes to be enforcing the will of God or the injunctions of men. But the greater part of the courage that is needed in the world is not of a heroic kind. Courage may be displayed in everyday life as well as in historic fields of action. There needs, for example, the common courage to be honest, the courage to resist temptation, the courage to speak the truth, the courage to be what we really are, and not to pretend to be what we are not, the courage to live honestly within our own means, and not dishonestly upon the means of others. A great deal of the unhappiness and much of the vice of the world is owing to weakness and indecision of purpose, in other words, to lack of courage. Men may know what is right, and yet fail to exercise the courage to do it. They may understand the duty they have to do, but will not summon up the requisite resolution to perform it. The weak and undisciplined man is at the mercy of every temptation. He cannot say no, but falls before it; and if his companionship be bad, he will be all the easier led away by bad example into wrong doing. Nothing can be more certain than that the character can only be sustained and strengthened by its own energetic action. The will, which is the central force of character, must be trained to habits of decision, otherwise it will neither be able to resist evil nor to follow good. Decision gives the power of standing firmly, when to yield, however slightly, might be only the first step in a downhill course to ruin. Calling upon others for help in forming a decision is worse than useless. A man must so train his habits as to rely upon his own powers, and depend upon his own courage in moments of emergency. Plutarch tells of a king of Macedon who, in the midst of an action, withdrew into the adjoining town to sacrifice to Hercules, while his opponent Emilius, at the same time that he implored the divine aid, sought for victory sword in hand, and won the battle. And so it is ever in the actions of daily life. There needs also the exercise of no small degree of moral courage to resist the corrupting influences of what is called society. Although Mrs. Grundy may be a very vulgar and commonplace personage, her influence is nevertheless prodigious. Most men, but especially women, are the moral slaves of the class or caste to which they belong. There is a sort of unconscious conspiracy existing among them against each other's individuality. Each circle and section, each rank and class, has its respective customs and observances, to which conformity is required at the risk of being tabooed. Some are immured within a bastile of fashion, others of custom, others of opinion; and few there are who have the courage to think outside their sect, to act outside their party, and to step out into the free air of individual thought and action. We dress and eat and follow fashion, though it may be at the risk of debt, ruin, and misery; living not so much according to our means as according to the superstitious observances of our class. Though we may speak contemptuously of the Indians who flatten their heads, and of the Chinese who cramp their toes, we have only to look at the deformities of fashion among ourselves to see that the reign of Mrs. Grundy is universal. It is the strong and courageous men who lead and guide and rule the world. The weak and timid leave no trace behind them, while the life of a single upright and energetic man is like a track of light. His example is remembered and appealed to, and his thoughts, his spirit, and his courage continue to be the inspiration of succeeding generations. Men often conquer difficulties because they feel they can. Their confidence in themselves inspires the confidence of others. When Caesar was at sea, and a storm began to rage, the captain of the ship which carried him became unmanned by fear. "What art thou afraid of?" cried the great captain. "Thy vessel carries Caesar." The courage of the brave man is contagious, and carries others along with it. His stronger nature awes weaker natures into silence, or inspires them with his own will and purpose. The persistent man will not be baffled or repulsed by opposition. Diogenes, desirous of becoming the disciple of Antisthenes, went and offered himself to the cynic. He was refused. Diogenes still persisting, the cynic raised his knotty staff and threatened to strike him if he did not depart. "Strike," said Diogenes; "you will not find a stick hard enough to conquer my perseverance." Antisthenes, overcome, had not another word to say, but forthwith accepted him as his pupil. Inspired by energy of purpose, men of comparatively mediocre powers have often been enabled to accomplish extraordinary results. The men who have most powerfully influenced the world have not been so much men of genius as men of strong convictions and enduring capacity for work, impelled by irresistible energy and invincible determination. Such men, for example, as were Mohammed, Luther, Knox, Calvin, Loyola, and Wesley. Courage combined with energy and perseverance will overcome difficulties apparently insurmountable. It gives force and impulse to effort, and does not permit it to retreat. Tyndall said of Faraday that in his warm moments he formed a resolution, and in his cool ones he made that resolution good. Perseverance, working in the right direction, grows with time, and when steadily practiced, even by the most humble, will rarely fail of its reward. Trusting in the help of others is of comparatively little use. When one of Michael Angelo's principal patrons died, he said, "I begin to understand that the promises of the world are for the most part vain phantoms, and that to confide in one's self and become something of worth and value is the best and safest course." It is the courageous man who can best afford to be generous, or rather it is his nature to be so. When Fairfax, at the battle of Naseby, seized the colors from an ensign whom he had struck down in the fight, he handed them to a common soldier to take care of. The soldier, unable to resist the temptation, boasted to his comrades that he himself seized the colors, and the boast was repeated to Fairfax. "Let him retain the honor," said the commander. "I have enough beside." So when Douglas, at the battle of Bannockburn, saw Randolph, his rival, outnumbered and apparently overpowered by the enemy, he prepared to hasten to his assistance. But seeing that Randolph was already driving them back, he cried out, "Hold and halt! We are come too late to aid them. Let us not lessen the victory they have won by affecting to claim a share in it." It is related of Charles V that, after the siege and capture of Wittenberg by the imperialist army, the monarch went to see the tomb of Luther. While reading the inscription on it, one of the servile courtiers who accompanied him proposed to open the grave and give the ashes of the heretic to the winds. The monarch's cheek flushed with honest indignation. "I war not with the dead," said he. "Let this place be respected." The portrait which the great Aristotle drew of the magnanimous man, in other words, the true gentleman, more than 2,000 years ago, is as faithful now as it was then. "The magnanimous man," he said, "will behave with moderation under both good fortune and bad. He will know how to be exalted and how to be abased. He will neither be delighted with success nor grieved by failure. He will neither shun danger nor seek it, for there are few things which he cares for. He is reticent and somewhat slow of speech, but speaks his mind openly and boldly when occasion calls for it. He overlooks injuries. He is not given to talk about himself or about others, for he does not care that he himself should be praised, or that other people should be blamed. He does not cry out about trifles, and craves help from none. On the other hand, mean men admire meanly. They have neither modesty, generosity, nor magnanimity. They are ready to take advantage of the weakness or defenselessness of others, especially where they have themselves succeeded, by unscrupulous methods, in climbing to positions of authority. Snobs in high places are always much less tolerable than snobs of low degree, because they have more frequent opportunities of making their want of manliness felt. They assume greater airs, and are pretentious in all that they do. And the higher their elevation, the more conspicuous is the incongruity of their position. "The higher the monkey climbs," says the proverb, "the more he shows his tail." Much depends on the way in which a thing is done. An act which might be taken as a kindness if done in a generous spirit, when done in a grudging spirit may be felt as stingy, if not harsh and even cruel. When Ben Jonson lay sick and in poverty, the king sent him a paltry message accompanied by a gratuity. The sturdy, plain-spoken poet's reply was, "I suppose he sends me this because I live in an alley. Tell him his soul lives in an alley." From what we have said, it will be obvious that to be of an enduring and courageous spirit is of great importance in the formation of character. It is a source not only of usefulness in life, but of happiness. On the other hand, to be of a timid and still more of a cowardly nature is one of the greatest misfortunes. A wise man was accustomed to say that one of the principal objects he aimed at in the education of his sons and daughters was to train them in the habit of fearing nothing so much as fear. And the habit of avoiding fear is, doubtless, capable of being trained like any other habit, such as the habit of attention, of diligence, of study, or of cheerfulness. Much of the fear that exists is the offspring of imagination, which creates the images of evils which may happen, but perhaps rarely do. And thus many persons who are capable of summoning up courage enough to grapple with and overcome real dangers are paralyzed or thrown into consternation by those which are imaginary. Hence, unless the imagination be held under strict discipline, we are prone to meet evils more than halfway, to suffer them by forestallment, and to assume the burdens which we ourselves create. Education in courage is not usually included among the branches of female training, and yet it is really of much greater importance than either music, French, or the use of the globes. Contrary to the view of Sir Richard Steele, that women should be characterized by a tender fear and inferiority which makes her lovely, we would have women educated in resolution and courage as a means of rendering them more helpful, more self-reliant, and vastly more useful and happy. There is, indeed, nothing attractive in timidity, nothing lovable in fear. All weakness, whether of mind or body, is equivalent to deformity, and the reverse of interesting. Courage is graceful and dignified, while fear in any form is mean and repulsive. Yet the utmost tenderness and gentleness are consistent with courage. Ari Scheffer, the artist, once wrote to his daughter, "Dear daughter, strive to be of good courage, to be gentle-hearted. These are the true qualities for woman. Troubles everybody must expect. There is but one way of looking at fate, whatever that be, whether blessings or afflictions, to behave with dignity under both. We must not lose heart, or it will be the worst both for ourselves and for those whom we love. To struggle, and again to renew the conflict, this is life's inheritance." In sickness and sorrow none are braver and less complaining sufferers than women. Their courage, where their hearts are concerned, is indeed proverbial. Experience has proved that women can be as enduring as men under the heaviest trials and calamities, but too little pains are taken to teach them to endure petty terrors and frivolous vexations with fortitude. Such little miseries, if petted and indulged, quickly run into sickly sensibility, and become the bane of their life, keeping themselves and those about them in a state of chronic discomfort. The best corrective of this condition of mind is wholesome moral and mental discipline. Mental strength is as necessary for the development of woman's character as of man's. It gives her capacity to deal with the affairs of life, and presence of mind, which enable her to enact with vigor and effect in moments of emergency. Character in a woman, as in a man, will always be found the best safeguard of virtue, the best nurse of religion, the best corrective of time. Personal beauty soon passes, but beauty of mind and character increases in attractiveness the older it grows. Women have not only distinguished themselves for their passive courage, but, impelled by affection or the sense of duty, they have become heroic. When the band of conspirators who sought the life of James II. Of Scotland burst into his lodgings at Perth, the king called to the ladies, who were in the chamber outside his room, to keep the door as well as they could, and give him time to escape. The conspirators had previously destroyed the locks of the doors, so that the keys could not be turned, and when they reached the lady's apartment, it was found that the bar also had been removed. But on hearing them approach, the brave Catherine Douglas, with the hereditary courage of her family, boldly thrust her arm across the door instead of the bar, and held it there until, her arm being broken, the conspirators burst into the room with drawn swords and daggers, overthrowing the ladies, who, though unarmed, still endeavored to resist them. The defense of Latham House by Charlotte de Tremouille, the worthy descendant of William of Nassau and Admiral Coligny, was another striking instance of heroic bravery on the part of a noble woman. When summoned by the parliamentary forces to surrender, she declared that she had been entrusted by her husband with the defense of the house, and that she could not give it up without her dear lord's order, but trusted in God for protection and deliverance. In her arrangements for the defense she described as having left nothing with her eye to be excused afterwards by fortune or negligence, and added to her former patience a most resolved fortitude. The brave lady held her house and home against the enemy for a whole year, during 3 months of which the place was strictly besieged and bombarded, until at length the siege was raised, after a most gallant defense, by the advance of the royalist army. Nor can we forget the courage of Lady Franklin, who persevered to the last, when the hopes of all others had died out, in prosecuting the search after the Franklin expedition. On the occasion of the Royal Geographical Society determining to award the Founder's Medal to Lady Franklin, Sir Roderick Murchison observed that, in the course of a long friendship with her, he had abundant opportunity of observing and testing the sterling qualities of a woman who had proved herself worthy of the admiration of mankind. Nothing daunted by failure after failure, through 12 long years of hope deferred, she had persevered, with a singleness of purpose and a sincere devotion which were truly unparalleled. And now that her last expedition, under the gallant McClintock, had realized the two great facts, that her husband had traversed wide seas unknown to former navigators, and died in discovering a northwest passage, then surely the adjudication of the medal would be hailed by the nation as one of the many recompenses to which the widow of the illustrious Franklin was so eminently entitled. But that devotion to duty which marks the heroic character has more often been exhibited by women in deeds of charity and mercy. The greater part of these are never known, for they are done in private, out of the public sight, and for the mere love of doing good. Where fame has come to them, because of the success which has attended their labors in a more general sphere, it has come unsought and unexpected, and is often felt as a burden. Who has not heard of Mrs. Fry and Miss Carpenter as prison visitors and reformers; of Mrs. Chisholm and Miss Rye as promoters of emigration; and of Miss Nightingale and Miss Garrett as apostles of hospital nursing? That these women should have emerged from the sphere of private and domestic life to become leaders in philanthropy indicates no small degree of moral courage on their part; for to women, above all others, quiet and ease and retirement are most natural and welcome. Very few women step beyond the boundaries of home in search of a large field of usefulness; but when they have desired one, they have had no difficulty in finding it. The ways in which men and women can help their neighbors are innumerable. It needs but the willing heart and ready hand. Most of the philanthropic workers we have named, however, have scarcely been influenced by choice. The duty lay in their way; it seemed to be the nearest to them, and they set about doing it without desire for fame, or any other reward but the approval of their own conscience. Among prison visitors the name of Sarah Martin is much less known than that of Mrs. Fry, although she preceded her in the work. How she was led to undertake it furnishes at the same time an illustration of womanly true-heartedness and earnest womanly courage. Sarah Martin was the daughter of poor parents, and was left an orphan at an early age. She was brought up by her grandmother, and earned her living by going out to families as assistant dressmaker, at $1 a day. In 1819 a woman was tried and sentenced to imprisonment in Yarmouth jail for cruelly beating and ill-using her child, and her crime became the talk of the town. The young dressmaker was much impressed by the report of the trial, and the desire entered her mind of visiting the woman in jail and trying to reclaim her. She had often before, on passing the walls of the borough jail, felt impelled to seek admission, with the object of visiting the inmates, reading the Scriptures to them, and endeavoring to lead them back to the society whose laws they had violated. At length she could not resist the impulse to visit the imprisoned mother. She entered the jail porch, lifted the knocker, and asked the jailer for admission. For some reason or other she was refused, but she returned, repeated her request, and this time she was admitted. The culprit mother shortly stood before her. When Sarah Martin told the motive of her visit, the criminal burst into tears and thanked her. Those tears and thanks shaped the whole course of Sarah Martin's after life, and the poor seamstress, while maintaining herself by her needle, continued to spend her leisure hours in visiting the prisoners and endeavoring to alleviate their condition. She constituted herself their chaplain and schoolmistress, for at that time they had neither. She read to them, and taught them to read and write. She gave up an entire day in the week for this purpose, besides Sundays, as well as other intervals of spare time. She taught the women to knit, to sew, and to cut out, the sale of the articles enabling her to buy other materials, and to continue the industrial education thus begun. She also taught the men to make straw hats, men's and boys' caps, gray cotton shirts, and even patchwork, anything to keep them out of idleness, and from preying on their own thoughts. Out of the earnings of the prisoners in this way she formed a fund, which she applied to furnishing them with work on their discharge, thus enabling them again to begin the world honestly, and at the same time affording her, as she herself says, the advantage of observing their conduct. By attending too exclusively to this prison work, however, Sarah Martin's dressmaking business fell off, and the question arose with her whether, in order to recover her business, she was to suspend her prison work. But her decision had already been made. I had counted the cost, she said, and my mind was made up. If, while imparting truth to others, I became exposed to temporal want, the privation so momentary to an individual would not admit of comparison with following the Lord in thus administering to others. She now devoted 6 or 7 hours every day to the prisoners, converting what would otherwise have been a scene of dissolute idleness into a hive of orderly industry. Newly admitted prisoners were sometimes refractory, but her persistent gentleness eventually won their respect and cooperation. Men old in years and crime, pert London pickpockets, depraved boys and dissolute sailors, profligate women, smugglers, and the promiscuous horde of criminals which usually fill the jail of a seaport and county town, all submitted to the benign influence of this good woman, and under her eyes they might be seen, for the first time in their lives, striving to hold a pen, or to master the characters in a penny primer. She entered into their confidence, watched, wept, prayed, and felt for all by turns. She strengthened their good resolutions, cheered the hopeless and despairing, and endeavored to put all, and hold all, in the right road of amendment. For more than 20 years this good and true-hearted woman pursued her noble course, with little encouragement and not much help, almost her only means of subsistence consisting in an annual income of 10 or 12 pounds left by her grandmother, eked out by her little earnings at dressmaking. During the last 2 years of her ministration, the borough magistrates, knowing that her self-imposed labors saved them the expense of a schoolmaster and chaplain, made a proposal to her of an annual salary of 12 pounds a year. but they did it in so indelicate a manner as to greatly wound her sensitive feelings. She shrank from becoming the salaried official of the corporation, and bartering for money those services which had throughout been labors of love. But the jail committee coarsely informed her that if they permitted her to visit the prison she must submit to their terms, or be excluded. For 2 years, therefore, she received the salary of £12 a year, the acknowledgment of the Yarmouth Corporation for her services as jail chaplain and schoolmistress. She was now, however, becoming old and infirm, and the unhealthy atmosphere of the jail did much toward finally disabling her. While she lay on her deathbed, she resumed the exercise of a talent she had occasionally practiced before in her moments of leisure — the composition of sacred poetry. As works of art they may not excite admiration, yet never were verses written truer in spirit or fuller of Christian love. But her own life was a nobler poem than any she ever wrote, full of true courage, perseverance, charity, and wisdom. It was, indeed, a commentary upon her own words: "The high desire that others may be blessed savors of heaven." End of Chapter 18. Courage. Read by John Greenman.